The sky above Velara Prime burned with the wrong colors as commander. Thesic watched another defense platform explode in orbit. The Krithek swarm had been eating through the galaxy for 3 years now, and every species that stood against them had fallen back or fallen silent. Thesic's feathers ruffled against the hot wind that blew across the command bunker as massive biological ships descended through the atmosphere like diseased moons. The Seraphim commander had fought in 14 battles against the swarm and lost 13 of them. Only quick retreats and sacrifice. Plays had let anyone survive those encounters, but there would be no retreating from Velara Prime because this was the last fortress world between the Kritheks and the core systems of the Galactic Concordat. Status report. Thesic commanded, and their talons clicked against the tactical display. Sub-Commander Virith of the Crystalline Prismatics looked up from her console with all 3 of her optical nodes dim with exhaustion. Outer wall sections 4 through 9 have been breached, she reported in her chiming voice that sounded like breaking glass. The acid spitters are melting through our reinforced barriers faster than we can replace them. Thesic pulled up the defensive grid and immediately wished they hadn't because the tactical map was a sea of red enemy markers, flowing toward their position like a tsunami of living weapons. The Kritheks didn't use technology the way other species did because they were technology. Millions of years of directed evolution had turned them into biological warships and living siege engines and acid-spewing nightmares that adapted to every weapon used against them. How long until the evacuation transports are loaded? Thesic asked and already knew the answer would be bad. 6 hours at current pace, answered Lieutenant Breaker, his forearms working frantically across multiple control panels. We have 300,000 civilians still in the shelters, and the transport capacity is... An explosion rocked the bunker and cut off his words as dust rained from the ceiling. The lights flickered and died, then emergency systems kicked in, bathing everything in sickly green illumination. That was the Eastern Power Relay, Virith announced, and her crystalline body actually cracked with stress. We're down to backup generators. Thesic's communication implant chirped with incoming messages from a dozen squad leaders, all screaming for reinforcements they didn't have. Section 7 reported Krithek's warriors breaking through their lines, and the soldiers there were down to their last ammunition reserves. Section 12 had gone completely silent 3 minutes ago, which meant everyone there was probably already dissolved into organic paste. The Seraphim commander made the calculations in their head and came to the same conclusion they'd reached in the last 13 battles. They were going to lose. 300,000 civilians needed 6 hours, and the defensive lines would collapse in maybe 2 if they were lucky. Reroute all available forces to protect the evacuation zones, Thesic ordered, even though it meant abandoning the outer settlements. Pull everyone back to the inner perimeter, and, Commander, Virith's voice cut through with sudden urgency. I'm receiving a transmission on emergency frequencies. Put it through, Thesic said, and expected another plea for help from some doomed position. The voice that came through the speakers was strange and flat with odd pronunciation of Concordat standard. This is Captain Chun of the UTF's Perseverance to Velara Prime Command, the voice said. We received your distress beacon approximately 48 hours ago, and we're inbound with reinforcements. Thesic and Virith exchanged confused looks because neither of them recognized the designation UTFS or had ever heard of the species transmitting. Unknown vessel, this is Commander Thesic, they responded. Identify your species and fleet strength. We are human from the Terran systems, Captain Chan answered. We have one carrier group with full marine complement and will reach your position in approximately 90 minutes. Human. Thesic had never heard of them and quickly searched the Concordat database while the transmission continued. We understand you're under heavy assault. the human captain said. "Hold your positions and we'll break through." Their orbital blockade. The database returned no results for humans or Terran systems, which meant this was either a species from the far rim or a classified first contact scenario. "Captain Chen, we appreciate any assistance, but you should know the Kritheks have 700 capital-class bioships in orbit and support swarms numbering in the millions." Desik explained, because they didn't want these strangers flying blindly into a grinder. "We're facing total tactical collapse within 2 hours. There was a pause on the line, and Desik heard other voices conferring in a language that sounded harsh and rapid. "Understood, Commander," Chen replied. "We've fought biological hive species before, and we know what we're walking into, so just hold on, because the cavalry's coming." The transmission ended before Desik could ask what a cavalry was. "Should we factor them into our defensive calculations?" Virith asked, and her optical nodes brightened slightly with something that might have been hope. Desik wanted to say yes, because even one more carrier group could buy precious time, but they'd commanded too many desperate battles to trust in miracles. "Continue evacuation protocols," they ordered. "If these humans arrive in time, then we'll coordinate with them, but we plan as if we're on our own." The next 90 minutes were the longest in Desik's life. Reports flooded in of Kritheks biotanks smashing through reinforced bunkers and swarms of flyers, dropping living bombs on their artillery positions. They lost Section 4 completely when a massive acid spitter dissolved the entire defensive wall and everything behind it. Casualties mounted into the thousands, and then tens of thousands as soldiers held impossible positions with dwindling ammunition. Desik authorized the use of tactical nuclear devices on 3 breaches, which slowed the swarm, but only temporarily, because the Kritheks evolved resistance to radiation faster than any species had right to. The evacuation was at 40% when the last orbital platform exploded and left Velara Prime completely exposed to the swarm. "Fleet above." Virith looked at Desik with her optical nodes nearly dark and spoke the words neither wanted to hear. "Commander, we need to begin emergency evacuation of command staff," she said quietly. "If we lose this bunker, we hold." Desik interrupted, and their feathers stood rigid with determination, even though they knew it was futile. Then something impossible happened. Every sensor in the bunkers suddenly screamed, with new contacts emerging from slipspace directly inside the Kritheks blockade. "Multiple vessels emerging," Virith announced, and her voice pitched high with shock. Reading 47 ships of unknown configuration. The tactical display updated and showed the new arrivals painted in blue as friendly unknowns. They were moving fast and accelerating straight toward the thickest concentration of swarm bioships instead of taking evasive positions. "Those are the humans," Breaker said and enhanced the visual feed. "And they're not slowing down." Desik watched the display and felt their hearts skip beats, because the human ships were charging directly into the Kritheks formation like they were attacking rather than trying to reach the planet. "That's suicide," Virith whispered. The first human ship hit the swarm line, and instead of being destroyed, it punched straight through with weapons blazing and shields burning bright enough to see from the surface. Then another ship followed and another, and suddenly the ordered Kritheks blockade erupted into chaos as these mad newcomers tore into them without hesitation or fear. "They're fighting," Desik said, and couldn't keep the wonder from their voice. "They're actually fighting their way through." "Commander, I'm receiving landing vectors," Breaker reported. "Multiple dropships requesting coordinates for emergency deployment." Desik straightened and felt something they hadn't felt in 3 years of losing battles. "Hope, send them our defensive positions and clear the southern landing zones," they ordered. "And someone find out what the hell a human is." The dropships came down like meteors through the burning sky, and Desik watched from the command bunker as dozens of angular vessels punched through the atmosphere. trailing fire and scattering Krithex flyers like insects. These weren't the sleek organic curves that most concordat species preferred, but instead harsh geometric shapes covered in armor plating and weapon emplacements. They're not even trying to avoid the anti-air fire, Virith observed as a human dropship took a direct hit from a Krithex myoplasma cannon and kept coming with half its hull glowing red-hot. The ship slammed into the southern landing zone hard enough to crack the ferrocrete pad, and before it even finished, skidding to a halt, the side hatches exploded outward. What emerged made Desik's breath catch in their throat. The humans were bipedal, which was common enough, but they moved wrong. Too fast and too aggressive, and wearing armor that looked like it was designed to take damage rather than avoid it. They poured out of the dropships in organized units and immediately opened fire on the Krithex positions with weapons that made sharp cracking sounds instead of the usual energy weapon hums. "What kind of weapons are those?" Virith asked as she magnified the visual feed. "Kinetic projectiles," Breaker answered, and his voice carried disbelief. "They're using chemically propelled metal slugs." Desik couldn't believe what they were seeing because chemical propellants were technology from the early industrial age. Every species in the Concordat had moved past such primitive weapons thousands of years ago. But primitive or not, the human weapons were tearing through Krithex warriors with brutal efficiency as the Marines advanced in coordinated fire teams. "They're pushing forward," Desik said, and checked the tactical display. Why are they pushing forward? Every defensive doctrine in the Concordat emphasized holding positions and creating kill zones, because advancing into a Krithex swarm was how you died quickly. But the humans were doing exactly that, and somehow not dying. They moved from cover to cover with practiced precision, and when Krithex warriors charged them, the humans met them with close-range fire and what looked like explosive devices thrown by hand. One Marine ran out of ammunition, and instead of retreating, pulled out a long blade from their armor and engaged a Krithex warrior in hand-to-hand combat. "Send a security team to meet their commander," Desik ordered. "I need to understand what we're dealing with." 20 minutes later, a human walked into the command bunker, and Desik got their first close look at the species that had just plunged into hell without hesitation. She was tall for a bipedal species, with dark brown skin and close-cropped black hair, and her armor was scarred and dented like she'd been fighting for years. "Commander Desik?" she asked in Concordat Standard with that same flat accent. "I'm Colonel Sarah Okonkwo of the United Terran Forces." "Colonel," Desik replied and gestured to the tactical display. "Your timing is fortunate, but your tactics are concerning because your forces are advancing into concentrated enemy positions." Okonkwo looked at the display and something that might have been amusement crossed her face. "Commander, with respect, we didn't come here to hold positions," she said. "We came here to push these bugs back and give your people time to evacuate. The Krithex adapt to every tactic within hours," Virith explained. "Advancing into them means higher casualties, and an alarm cut her off as proximity sensors screamed a warning. "Krithex breakthrough in Section 9. Breaker shouted. "Multiple warrior-class units are in the command bunker access tunnels." Desik drew their plasma pistol and turned toward the blast doors, even as they heard the sounds of chittering and scraping getting closer. The Seraphim commander had fought Krithex warriors before and knew that in close quarters, they were nearly unstoppable killing machines. Security teams seal the command level and fall back to secondary positions. They ordered into their comm. Colonel Okonkwo calmly pulled a weapon from her hip that looked different from the rifles her troops carried. It was shorter and blockier with a wider barrel. "How many contacts?" she asked, and her voice was steady like this was routine. "At least 15 warrior class," Virith answered. "They'll be through the blast doors in seconds." "Good," Okonkwo said and chambered a round into her weapon with a mechanical click. "Hate, waiting," Before Thesic could ask what she meant, the blast doors exploded inward, and Krithek's warriors poured through the gap. Each warrior was 3 meters of chitin-armored nightmare with 6 limbs, ending in razor-sharp blades and mandibles that could bite through steel. Okonkwo opened fire, and her weapon boomed like thunder in the confined space. Each shot hit with devastating force that blew chunks from the Krithek's warriors and sent them tumbling backward. She moved forward into their charge, rather than away from it, which went against every survival instinct. Thesic had. 2 warriors flanked her and struck with blinding speed, but Okonkwo ducked under one strike and used her weapon to deflect the second before shooting both attackers at point-blank range. Then her weapon clicked empty, and a warrior lunged at her with all 6 blades extended. The human colonel dropped her gun and pulled a long knife from her armor and actually stepped into the warrior's attack. She twisted her body in a way that let the blades pass around her while simultaneously driving her knife into the gap between the warrior's head and thorax. The Krithek screamed and thrashed, but Okonkwo held on and used her body weight to drive the blade deeper until something vital gave way and the warrior collapsed. She retrieved her knife and calmly picked up her weapon while 3 more warriors charged toward her position. Thesic and the bunker security team opened fire with their plasma weapons and cut down 2 of the warriors. The third made it through and raised its blades to strike the colonel from behind. Okonkwo spun and threw her knife with casual precision, and the blade buried itself in the warrior's primary optical cluster. The Krithek's warrior stumbled, and she closed the distance in 2 long strides, then retrieved her knife and finished the creature with brutal efficiency. 15 seconds later, the attack was over, and 9 Krithek's warriors lay dead or dying in the command bunker. Colonel Okonkwo reloaded her weapon and cleaned her knife on a dead warrior's carapace like this was just another day. "Your species fights Krithek's warriors in hand-to-hand combat?" Thesic asked because they couldn't quite believe what they'd just witnessed. "When we have to," Okonkwo replied with a slight shrug. "Though we prefer to shoot them from a distance." "How is that possible?" Virith demanded. "Krithek's warriors are optimized killing machines with reaction times faster than most species can perceive." The human colonel looked at the crystalline officer with eyes that had seen too much combat. "So are we," she said simply. "Humans evolved on a death world where everything tried to kill us, so we got good at killing back." Thesic pulled up a database query on human biology while Okonkwo coordinated with her troops. What they found made their feathers stand on end. Humans came from a planet classified as a Class 12 death world, which was the highest danger rating in Concordat records. Their gravity was higher than standard, which explained their dense muscle structure. Their atmosphere had oxygen levels that would be toxic to most species. Their planet was covered in apex predators and poisonous plants and environmental hazards that killed weaker organisms daily. And somehow humans had not only survived, but thrived and developed interstellar travel. "Colonel, I'm looking at your species profile," Thesic said carefully. "It says humans are persistence hunters?" "That's right," Okonkwo confirmed while checking her tactical display. "We're not the fastest or strongest, but we don't stop and our prey eventually collapses from exhaustion. And your homeworld has multiple apex predators that regularly attacked your ancestors?" "Had," the colonel corrected. "We hunted most of them to extinction, or drove them into protected reserves because they competed with us for resources." Thess felt a taut chill run through their body because they were starting to understand what the Concordat had just invited into this war. The humans weren't just another species fleeing the Kritheks. They were predators from a world that made the swarm look almost reasonable by comparison. "Your evacuation is at 60%, Okonkwo reported. "My Marines have secured a perimeter around the landing zones and pushed the Kritheks back 3 kilometers. 3 kilometers? Breaker repeated in shock. "In under an hour?" The human colonel nodded as if this was normal. "We'll hold this position until every civilian is off-world," she stated. "That's what we came here to do." Desik looked at the tactical display and saw human positions marked in blue, pushing deeper into Red Krithik's controlled territory. Saw casualty reports that would have broken any Concordat unit's morale, but the humans just kept advancing. Saw a species that didn't know how to retreat because they'd spent their entire evolutionary history learning to push forward. "Colonel Okonkwo," Desik said slowly, "what does your species do when you're outnumbered and outgunned?" The human smiled, and it wasn't a comforting expression. "We fight anyway, Commander," she replied, "because that's all we know how to do." 3 weeks after the humans arrived on Valara Prime, the planet had been transformed from a dying fortress into something that looked like it might actually survive. Desik walked through the newly fortified defensive positions and marveled at what they saw. The humans had dug trenches, actual trenches in the ground like primitive warriors from pre-industrial civilizations. But these trenches were connected by underground tunnels and reinforced with prefabricated materials and studded with firing positions that created overlapping fields of fire. "They're building permanent fortifications," Virith observed as she accompanied the commander on their inspection. "As if they plan to stay here indefinitely." A human sergeant overseeing a construction crew looked up and wiped sweat from his forehead. Ma'am," he greeted with a nod. "We're almost done with the eastern approach defenses." "Sergeant, why are you digging into the ground?" Desik asked. "Modern defensive shields provide better protection with less effort." The sergeant, whose name tape read Martinez, considered the question while his crew continued working. "Shields fail when you lose power, Commander," he explained. "Dirt doesn't, and when you're fighting for weeks or months, you want something that'll still be there when the generators die." "You expect to be fighting for months?" Virith asked. "We prepare for it, ma'am," Martinez replied. "Hope for the best, but plan for the worst, because that's how you survive." Desik nodded and continued their inspection. Everywhere they looked, human soldiers were working with an intensity that bordered on obsessive. Some were setting up weapon emplacements while others ran continuous combat drills, and a third group was actually training Concordat troops in human tactics. The Seraphim commander stopped to watch a human corporal demonstrating close-quarters combat to a group of prismatic soldiers. "The key is to keep moving," the corporal explained. "Krithek's warriors are fast, but they commit to their attacks, so if you're already moving when they strike, you can use their momentum against them." One of the prismatic soldiers, whose crystalline body was too rigid for such fluid motion, raised a limb in question. "But human bodies can bend in ways ours cannot," the soldier pointed out. "Then find what your body can do that theirs can't," the corporal responded. "You prismatics can reflect energy attacks, right? Use that and make the Kritheks shoot each other." It was practical adaptive thinking that impressed Desik. The humans didn't assume everyone fought like them, but instead helped each species find their own advantages. A medical tent caught the commander's attention, and they diverted to inspect the human field hospital. Inside they found Dr. Sarah Chun, treating both human and Concordat wounded with equal care. "Commander," she greeted while finishing a bandage on a Seraphim soldier's wing. "What can I do for you?" "I wanted to understand human medical capabilities," Desik said. "We've noticed your soldiers recover from injuries faster than expected." Dr. Chun smiled and gestured to a recovery ward where several Marines were resting. "Humans are remarkably resilient," she explained. "We evolved to heal from trauma because our ancestors got injured constantly, and those who healed faster had better survival rates." She pulled up a holographic display showing human cellular biology. "CR blood clotting factors activate within seconds of injury, and our immune system is actually quite aggressive, which helps fight infection. But I've seen reports of human soldiers fighting with injuries that would incapacitate most species." Virith interjected. The doctor's expression grew more serious. That's partly biology and partly psychology, she admitted. Humans produce natural pain suppressors, called endorphins during high-stress situations, and our adrenal system can override normal physical limitations temporarily. That sounds dangerous, Besic observed. It is, Chun agreed. We can literally push our bodies past safe limits, which causes long-term damage, but it keeps us alive in the short term. A soldier in one of the recovery beds coughed, and Besic noticed the wheezing sound. What happened to him? The commander asked. Krithek spore attacked 2 days ago, Dr. Chun replied. The spores are designed to suffocate oxygen breathers by filling their lungs with fungal growth. Besic knew about those attacks because they'd killed hundreds of Concordat troops in previous battles. How is he still alive? Human lungs are surprisingly adaptable, the doctor explained. We evolved at various altitudes on Earth, so our respiratory system can function even when compromised, and his immune system is fighting off the fungal infection. The soldier in question sat up and gave a weak thumbs-up gesture. I'll be back on duty tomorrow, Doc, he said with a grin. You'll be back when I clear you private, Chun replied firmly but not unkindly. Besic left the medical tent with more questions than answers. That night there was a Krithek's assault on the northern perimeter, and the commander watched from the command center as human forces responded. The attack came after sunset, when visibility was limited and most Concordat species struggled to coordinate in darkness. But the humans seemed to come alive in the dark. Their tactical communications became sharper and their movements more coordinated. How are they fighting so effectively without proper lighting? Breaker wondered as he watched the battle feeds. Colonel Okonkwo, who was coordinating the defense, heard the question and answered. Humans are actually pretty good in low-light conditions, she said. Our eyes evolved to hunt during dawn and dusk when many prey species were active. The tactical display showed human squads moving through the darkness with confidence, while Krithek's warriors stumbled into carefully prepared ambush. We also have technology, Okonkwo continued and tapped her helmet. Night vision and thermal imaging give us a significant advantage when the sun goes down. The battle lasted 3 hours, and when it ended the Kritheks had been driven back with heavy casualties while human losses were minimal. Besic was reviewing the after-action reports when Private First Class Jackson came into the command bunker with a meal delivery. The human soldier set down containers of food, and Besic noticed his hands were scarred and calloused. Private, may I ask you something? The commander said. Sure thing, Commander, Jackson replied. Why do humans continue fighting when the odds are against them? Besic asked. Most species calculate survival probabilities and retreat when success becomes unlikely. Jackson thought about the question while organizing the meal containers. I guess because retreating doesn't guarantee survival either, he said slowly. My dad used to say that humans are too stubborn to know when we're beaten and too mean to die easy. But you must feel fear, Virith interjected. Your biology includes stress responses. Oh, we definitely feel fear, Jackson agreed. But humans learned a long time ago that being scared and being defeated are two different things. He picked up his delivery bag and headed for the exit, but paused at the door. We come from a planet that tried to kill us with weather and predators and diseases and disasters, he added. And we're still here, so some alien bugs don't seem that scary in comparison. After he left, Besic pulled up more information about Earth and its history. What they found was a catalog of horrors. Ice ages that should have driven humans extinct, but instead they adapted. Volcanic eruptions that blocked out the sun and they survived. Plagues that killed significant portions of their population and they rebuilt. Wars between their own kind that devastated entire continents and they learned and continued. Every time something should have ended humanity, they just got more creative about surviving. They're not just resilient, Besic said aloud. They're persistent to the point of absurdity. Is that a useful trait in war? Virith asked. The commander looked at the tactical display showing human positions holding firm against the Krithek swarm. Looked at casualty reports that would have broken any other species' morale. But the humans just adjusted and kept fighting. Looked at a species that evolved to chase prey across continents over days until it collapsed from exhaustion. Against the Kritheks? Desik replied, "It might be the most useful trait possible." A new alert appeared on the display showing Krithek's forces massing for another assault. Colonel Okonkwo saw it and started issuing orders to her troops with calm efficiency. "All units prepare for incoming attack," she commanded. "Remember your training and watch your sectors." Desik listened to the human soldiers acknowledge orders with phrases like "hua" and "ora" that seemed to be battle cries. There was no panic in their voices. No desperation or fear, just grim determination and the absolute refusal to give up ground they'd claimed. The Kritheks came in waves as they always did, but this time they crashed against defenses held by humans, who had been fighting extinction since before they discovered fire. And for the first time since the war began, Desik watched the swarm hesitate. Watched Krithek's warriors pause before charging positions, where humans waited with weapons and blades and an evolutionary history of killing things bigger and meaner than themselves. The assault broke after 2 hours, and the Kritheks withdrew, which was something Desik had never seen them do before. "They're learning to be cautious," Virith observed with wonder. "They're learning to be afraid," Desik corrected, because the Krithek swarm had finally encountered prey that hunted back. The intelligence came from a captured Krithek scout that human interrogators had somehow kept alive long, enough to extract information from its neural cluster. Commander Desik stood in the briefing room and stared at the holographic display showing the location of the hive node controlling all Krithek's forces on Valar Prime. "It's buried here." Colonel Okonkwo pointed to a location deep in enemy-controlled territory, approximately 80 kilometers behind their front lines in what used to be the Meridian Processing Complex. The tactical display updated to show the defenses surrounding the target. Desik felt their hearts sink because the hive node was protected by an estimated 2 million Krithek's drones and warrior-class units. The Concordat High Command will never approve an assault on that position, Sub-Commander Virith stated. The casualties would be catastrophic, which is exactly why the Kritheks put it there, Okonkwo replied. They know we calculate acceptable losses, and that position exceeds any reasonable threshold. General Kritheks of the Armored Talents spoke up from his position at the table. His species was known for their tactical conservatism, and he represented the Concordat's military leadership. Colonel Okonkwo, even with your impressive capabilities, an assault on the hive node would require penetrating 80 kilometers of hostile territory, while under constant attack, he said. The mathematics are simple, and you would lose your entire force before reaching the objective. The human colonel stood and walked around the table studying the holographic display from different angles. What if we didn't try to hold the territory we crossed? She asked. Explain. Desik prompted. Standard doctrine is to advance and secure each position before moving forward, Okonkwo said. But what if we didn't? What if we just punched straight through to the target as fast as possible? You would be surrounded and cut off, General Krithek objected. Without supply lines or reinforcements, you would be destroyed. Maybe, the colonel agreed. But we'd only need to survive long enough to destroy the hive node, and once it's gone, the Kritheks on this planet lose their coordination. Desik understood what she was proposing, and it terrified them. You're suggesting a suicide mission. Okonkwo met the commander's eyes, and her expression was calm. I'm suggesting a mission with acceptable risks given the potential outcome, she corrected. If we destroy that hive node, we save this planet and prove the Kritheks can be beaten. Your soldiers would die, Virith said quietly. Some of them, yes, the colonel acknowledged. But humans have been dying for good causes since we learned to stand upright, and this cause seems worth it. The room fell silent because the other Concordat officers couldn't comprehend volunteering for certain death. Desic, however, had spent enough time around humans to understand their logic, even if it seemed insane. How would you execute this assault? The commander asked. Colonel Okonkwo pulled up a new tactical display. We use a spearhead formation with our heavy armor at the front and fast attack vehicles on the flanks, she explained. We punch through their lines before they can organize a proper response, and we keep moving no matter what. What about air support? General Krathix inquired. Human aerospace fighters will provide cover and drop ordnance on concentrated enemy positions, Okonkwo replied. We've also requisitioned atmospheric bombers to create a corridor of destruction that we'll drive through. She zoomed in on the hive node location. Once we reach the complex, our combat engineers will breach the structure and plant strategic explosives while the Marines hold a perimeter, the colonel continued. We blow the hive node and then fight our way back out. If you can fight your way back out, Virith pointed out. We're persistent like that, Okonkwo said with a slight smile. Desic made a decision that would haunt them for years, regardless of the outcome. I'll authorize Concordat support for your assault, they announced. Our artillery will provide fire missions, and our aerospace wings will coordinate with your fighters. General Krathix stood abruptly. Commander Desic, this is madness, he protested. The Concordat does not waste troops on hopeless gestures. It's not a hopeless gesture if it works, General, Desic replied. And I've watched these humans do impossible things for 3 weeks now, so maybe impossible is just another Tuesday for them. The assault launched at dawn 2 days later. Desic watched from the command center as human forces assembled into their spearhead formation. Heavy tanks that the humans called M1A5 Abrams formed the tip with their massive cannons and thick armor. Behind them came armored personnel carriers full of Marines and combat engineers. Fast attack vehicles with mounted weapons spread out on the flanks ready to intercept Krithek's flanking maneuvers. All units, this is Okonkwo. The colonel's voice came over the tactical network. You know the mission, and you know the stakes, so let's show these bugs what humans do when someone threatens our friends. The response from hundreds of human soldiers was a unified battle cry that made Desic's feathers stand on end. Then they attacked. The human spearhead hit the Krithek's lines like a hammer and just kept going. Shells from the Abrams tanks obliterated biofortifications, and the APCs rolled over Krithek's warriors that tried to block their path. Overhead, human fighters screamed through the sky, dropping bombs that turned the landscape into a hellscape of fire and destruction. They're maintaining 30 kilometers per hour through active combat, Virith reported in disbelief. How is that possible? Desic watched the tactical display as the human formation carved a path through Krithek's territory. Watched as casualties mounted, but the advance never slowed. Watched as human combat doctrine revealed itself to be built on acceptable losses rather than acceptable risks. 20 kilometers in the Kritheks finally organized a proper counterattack. Swarms of flyers descended on the human column, while biotanks emerged from underground tunnels. The flanking vehicles took heavy casualties, but they bought time for the main column to adjust. Human engineers deployed autonomous defense turrets that created a moving bubble of fire around the formation. Marines in the APCs fired from gunports at anything that got too close. The advance continued. 40 kilometers in Colonel Okonkwo's command vehicle took a direct hit from a Krithek's artillery organism. Okonkwo is down, someone shouted over the network. Desic felt their hearts stop because without the colonel's leadership, the assault would collapse. Then Okonkwo's voice came back on the radio, sounding strained but alive. Still here? She coughed. Switching to backup vehicle and continuing mission. The spearhead never even slowed down. At 60 kilometers, the Kritheks tried to collapse the corridor behind the human formation, cutting off any retreat. General Krathik saw this on the tactical display and turned to Desik. "They're trapped," he said. "We should order them to withdraw while they still can." "They knew this would happen, General," Desik replied. "And they're still going forward." 75 kilometers in the human formation was down to 60% strength, but the hive node was in sight. The Meridian Processing Complex had been transformed into a massive biostructure, with organic towers and pulsing membranes. At its center was the hive node itself, radiating psychic control signals to every Kritheks unit on the planet. "All units, this is Okonkwo," the colonel transmitted. "Final push, and remember, we're not just fighting for Valara Prime, but we're showing the whole galaxy that the Kritheks can." Bleed. The remaining tanks fired. Every shell they had at the complex's outer walls while combat. Engineers rushed forward with breaching charges. Marines established a defensive perimeter and held it against waves of Kritheks warriors that came screaming out of every tunnel and structure. Desik watched a human sergeant whose armor was cracked and smoking shoot a Kritheks warrior at point-blank range, then use his empty rifle as a club to beat down another. Watched Marines share ammunition with each other when they ran low and keep fighting even when wounded. Watched human medics drag injured soldiers to cover while still treating casualties under fire. The engineers breached the hive node chamber and Colonel Okonkwo led a squad inside. What happened next wasn't visible on any camera, but Desik heard the audio feed. The sound of weapons fire and screaming Kritheks and human voices shouting coordinates. Then Okonkwo's voice calmed despite the chaos. "Charges set," she reported. "All units evacuate to minimum safe distance. Colonel, you're still inside," Desik transmitted. "Get out of there. Working on it, Commander," Okonkwo replied, and there was the sound of more gunfire. "Got some uninvited guests who don't want us to leave." 30 seconds later, Colonel Okonkwo emerged from the hive node structure, running and firing behind her. "Blow it," she shouted. The charges detonated, and the entire complex erupted in a massive explosion that mushroomed into the sky. The hive node's psychic scream was audible even through the radio, as billions of neural connections were severed simultaneously. Across Valara Prime, every Kritheks unit suddenly lost coordination. Warriors stopped mid-attack and wandered aimlessly. Bioships in orbit began drifting without direction. The swarm that had seemed unstoppable for 3 years had just been decapitated. "They did it," Virith whispered. "Those insane humans actually did it." Desik opened a channel to Colonel Okonkwo, Colonel Status Report. The Concordat High Council chamber on the orbital station above Valara Prime had never seen such heated debate. Commander Desik stood before the assembled leaders of 17 species and argued for something that would have been unthinkable 6 months ago. "We should launch a counteroffensive," they stated clearly. "With human forces leading the assault, we can push the Kritheks back and reclaim lost territory." General Krathik rose from his seat, and his armor bulk made the platform creak. "Commander Desik, your recent experiences have clouded your judgment," he said. "The humans won a single battle through reckless tactics and acceptable casualties that no civilized species would tolerate. They saved an entire planet," Desik countered, "and proved the Kritheks can be defeated." Admiral Sheen of the Aquatic Depth Dwellers added her voice. "The human approach to warfare is disturbing," she said, with her translator rendering her sonar-based speech into standard. "They accept casualty rates that approach 20% in some engagements, because they understand that losing 20% in a winning battle is better than losing 100% in a losing war," Desik argued. Councillor Vexner of the insectoid hive minds, who had lost 3 colony worlds to the Kritheks, spoke up. "Perhaps we should hear from the humans themselves," he suggested. "Let them explain their strategy." Colonel Okonkwo was called to the chamber, and she entered wearing her dress uniform which was decorated with medals and commendations. She stood before the council and waited for permission to speak. Colonel Okonkwo, Counselor Vexner began. Can you explain why humanity believes it can win a war that we have been losing for 3 years? The colonel took a moment to gather her thoughts. With respect, Counselor, you've been losing because you're fighting the Kritheks like they're a conventional enemy, she replied. But they're not, and they require unconventional tactics, such as suicide missions and unacceptable casualties. General Kritheks interjected, such as understanding that war isn't a mathematical equation, Okonkwo responded. The Kritheks don't calculate odds or worry about losses because they're a hive mind that values the collective over individuals. She activated a holographic display, showing the Kritheks' expansion over the past 3 years. You've been retreating and consolidating because your doctrine prioritizes preservation, the colonel continued. But every time you retreat, the Kritheks gain resources and grow stronger. What would you suggest? Admiral Shen asked. Attack, Okonkwo said simply. Hit them hard and fast and don't give them time to adapt because the longer this war goes, the more advantages they gain. Desik watched the council members exchange uncertain looks. Humanity will commit its full military to this effort, the colonel added. We have 60 battle groups in nearby systems, and we can mobilize within 2 weeks. Why? Counselor Vexner asked. Your species only recently made contact with the Concordat, so why would you risk so much for us? Colonel Okonkwo met the counselor's compound eyes. Because humans have learned the hard way that threats like the Kritheks don't stop on their own, she explained. If we don't stop them here, they'll eventually reach our space, and by then they'll be even stronger. Also, she added, humanity has a policy about bullies, and we don't tolerate them. The vote was called, and it passed by a narrow margin. The Concordat would launch a counteroffensive with human forces forming the vanguard. 3 months later, the combined fleet assembled in the serious approach. Desik now held the rank of admiral and commanded a battle group of mixed Concordat and human ships. They stood on the bridge of the flagship Defiant Hope and watched as hundreds of vessels formed up into attack formations. Fleet status? They asked. All ships report ready, Commander Virith replied from her station. Human carrier groups are in position and marine assault ships are loaded. Colonel Okonkwo, who had been promoted to general, now commanded all human ground forces in the operation. She appeared on the communication screen looking confident. We're ready, Admiral, she reported. My troops are eager to take the fight to the enemy. The first target was the Krithek staging world of Terminus 9, where the swarm had established a major hive cluster. Intelligence suggested over 1 billion Kritheks units were garrisoned there, along with bioship construction facilities. The Concordat military had written off Terminus 9 as unrecoverable. The humans saw it as an opportunity. All ships prepare for slipspace insertion, Admiral Desik commanded. We emerge in combat formation and engage immediately. The fleet entered slipspace and reality twisted around them. Seconds later, they emerged directly above Terminus 9 and all hell broke loose. Krithek's bioships swarmed up to meet them like angry insects defending a nest. But this time the Concordat forces didn't retreat. Human carriers launched wave after wave of fighters that tore into the Krithek's formations. Concordat cruisers provided devastating, long-range fire support, while human destroyers got in close for brutal ship-to-ship combat. They're adapting to our weapons, Virith called out as Krithek's bioships began developing resistance to Concordat energy weapons. Switch to human kinetic weapons, Desik ordered. The Concordat ships had been fitted with human railguns and mass drivers specifically for this reason. Solid metal projectiles traveling at relativistic speeds didn't care about biological adaptation. The Krithek's fleet broke after 6 hours of sustained combat, and the invasion force descended to the planet. General Okonkwo led the assault personally, and Desik watched the battle feeds from orbit. Human Marines dropped in pods that crashed through Krithek's anti-air defenses and deployed in organized formations. They were supported by Concordat forces who had learned human tactics over the past months. The battle for Terminus 9 lasted 3 weeks. It was brutal and costly, and there were moments when Desik thought they would lose. But the humans never stopped pushing forward. When ammunition ran low, they used Krithek's bioweapons against them. When vehicles were destroyed, they fought on foot. When positions became untenable, they fell back and counterattacked from new angles. The Kritheks had never faced an enemy this persistent, and it showed in their tactics. They began making mistakes, overcommitting forces to attacks that were feints, failing to reinforce critical positions because they expected the humans to retreat, leaving hive nodes exposed because no sane species would penetrate that deep into enemy territory. General Okonkwo proved that humans weren't sane by any reasonable definition. She led a strike team into the primary hive cluster and destroyed the Queen Mind's command chamber. The Kritheks on Terminus 9 collapsed into chaos without central coordination. Mopping up operations took another 2 weeks, but the planet was liberated. The victory sent shockwaves through both the Concordat and the Krithek swarm. For the first time in 3 years, a major Krithek stronghold had fallen. But the cost was high, 30,000 human casualties, including 8,000 dead. Twice that many Concordat losses. Admiral Desik walked through the memorial service where humans honored their fallen. Each soldier's name was read aloud, and their comrades responded with a unified phrase. Until Valhalla, Desik didn't understand the reference, but they understood the sentiment. These warriors believed their fallen had gone somewhere honorable. General Okonkwo found the admiral standing before the wall of names. "They died well," the general said quietly. "They died," Desik replied. "Is there really a good way to do that?" Okonkwo considered the question. "For humans, yes," she answered. "Dying for something greater than yourself and knowing your death mattered is about as good as it gets." The counteroffensive continued for 6 more months. World after world was liberated as the combined Concordat-Human Alliance pushed deeper into Krithek space. The swarm adapted and evolved new weapons and tactics. But humans adapted faster because they'd spent their entire evolutionary history in an arms race with nature itself. The final battle came at the Krithek's home cluster, where the original Queen Minds had first spawned. The fleet that assembled for the assault was the largest military force the Concordat had ever fielded. 3,000 ships and 10 million soldiers. Admiral Desik commanded the operation from the Bridge of Defiant Hope. "This is it," they said to their crew. "Everything we fought for comes down to this battle." General Okonkwo appeared on screen. "My Marines are ready, Admiral," she reported. "We're going to finish this." The battle for the Krithek's home cluster was apocalyptic. Space became a nightmare of weapons fire and exploding ships. The planet below was covered in biofortifications and Krithek's warriors, numbering in the billions. Human and Concordat forces fought side by side in the most intense combat any of them had ever experienced. The turning point came when General Okonkwo led a boarding action against the Queen Mother's bioship. She and 5,000 Marines assaulted the vessel directly and fought through corridors made of living tissue. Desik watched the helmet camera feeds as humans battled Krithek's royal guards that were twice the size of normal warriors. Watched General Okonkwo reach the Queen Mother's chamber and face a creature the size of a building. The general set her weapon to overload and threw it directly at the Queen Mother's neural cluster.